Hey guys, Darren Kelly, Coach of Wildlish Pods, and welcome back to another episode of the AFL Fantasy 2025 preseason. On today's episode, we are going to be reviewing the second half of the preseason games that have occurred over the weekend, so let's get into it. So of the first 5 of the games we had over the weekend, we had the first three-peat that I can remember in the history of football, and it was very peculiar to watch, to see how it would function after a bit of speculation about how it would go. But overall, I thought it worked quite well. The 5th and 6th quarter probably wasn't super interesting to watch, as it was purely based second team basically putting the B team in. So this review pretty much basically be about the Q1 and Q3 and 4 as well. So we'll start off with Collingwood. So there wasn't a huge amount of names that we need to discuss in this one because it was quite a little bit tricky in terms of trying to evaluate individual players, because they did do a bit of an interesting way of dividing their best 22 players among the quarters. So, for example, a Pendles and a Quainer played in the 5th and 6th quarter rather than playing with the A team in the first quarter. So it was a little bit hard to decipher, and a few names that sort of popped up and sort of caught the eye based on that. But yeah, we'll get into them a little bit now. So some notable absentees that were in the side, were out of the side that did not play in this match was John De Goey. He's obviously still recovering from his injury. Same with Tom Mitchell. Mason Cox didn't play. Bobby Hill obviously missed with the All-Stars, and same with Ash Johnson. Looking through the mid-rotations in the first and second quarter, it was obviously Nick Dacos being the main one there. Cripps and Perryman, who's a little bit interesting there. But they also had Edward Allen and Elliott, who rotated through there as sort of the 4th and 5th midfielders playing elsewhere, because obviously Pendles didn't play in this quarter. So they did have to fill that hole a little bit. I'm probably not reading too much into Edward Allen. I think he's probably not going to be best 22 with just a lot of stars that are due to come back or should have been in their best 22 in this game. So not really going to look at him too much. Again, if he pops up next week, then definitely would be someone to look at, as I mentioned previously. In terms of their fantasy scores or the stars that sort of happened over in this game, Nick Dacos was obviously the star of the match. He was just absolutely everywhere doing we all know what he can do. Unfortunately, I still don't think we're touching him, even if he does present a bit of value, just purely based on he's got that bye in round 3. He's got a very tough run to start the season. He's going to cop a bit of attention, as we all know, because he is quite damaging. So I just don't think there's any point in starting him. I think we'll pick him up a bit cheaper than what he is currently. So for those sort of reasons, I'm not looking at starting him, even though he did look really good. And if you were keen on him, absolutely give him a pass mark, give him a tick, whatever your system is. He just looked absolutely amazing, and definitely didn't look like he was hindered by any injury concerns. As we know, he's been injured over the preseason, so no issues there if you were keen to start him, but it's a no for me at this point in time. His brother Josh Dacos, in his first showing as a halfback defender, he did pretty well. The role looked quite nice, but he didn't score super well. So I'm purely just looking at the role here, and if you're going based off that, I'd give it a tick. The only concern I have really is that there are so many guys back there that can distribute the ball. You know, Houston's someone that's just come back into the side. Who's just come into the side from Port Adelaide, who's mainly been a distributor at Port Adelaide. So I'm really starting to evaluate where I sort of sit with Josh Dacos. I think he could be an absolute top 6 defender if he does get the main distributor role, but I think they're going to be sharing the ball quite a lot along their back line. So probably a pass for me at this point in stage, but it's definitely worth a look next week to see if things change. Jacob Ryan was another one in the first and second quarter that really stood out to a lot of people. He took a fair few +6s in the back half, but again, based off that, there was no Maynard and there was no Quainer back there. I think he's very unlikely to be best 22. so I'm probably not looking at him as much as he would be a very nice defender rookie for us. I just don't see it happening unless they do run a seventh or even an eighth defender there. So I just don't think he'd be there. So probably one to keep an eye on, but again, he would have to play next week to be worth the option. And the final one I wanted to talk about was Reef McInnes. So we have known throughout the preseason that he was moving into the halfback line. He's trying to reinvent his career back there. He is a 324k forward, so it could be a very interesting pick. But again, the way I look at it and the way I see the Collingwood backline, he's got to be behind Moore, Maynard, Howe. Fullerton is another one who's been in there. Not Fullerton, Frampton. That's the name I looked for. Quainer, and then now Houston, who's coming to the role. That's already 6. So they would have to run a 7th defender, which isn't uncommon. Like a lot of teams do run a seven defenders and one on the bench. So definitely one I'm keen on, especially at that cheap price. So definitely one I want to keep an eye on next week. I just am concerned with obviously a lot of names that are before him, and obviously they've got Cripps that also can float back there, and that's probably what will happen when the likes of De Goey comes back or Tom Mitchell comes back into the side. Yeah, we just don't really have a solid timelines on those sort of guys yet. So I need some more answers on where they sort of sit before I can pick and back in a Reef McInnes to be that sort of defending player for us. But he looked absolute goods back there, just working his ass off to get plenty of +6s to be that distributor. So really like the look of him, and he's definitely one to keep an eye on. Besides that, Markov did alright, but I don't think he's one that we'll be considering this year. Perryman is definitely one that a lot of people are talking about. He's even in my side currently. He purely played as a CBA midfielder, playing that sort of defensive role, so he looked really good in there. Didn't have a huge amount of influence. Obviously, 32 points in the until halftime isn't amazing, but I think I definitely need to give another look. Brisbane aren't the easiest when it comes to points scored against, so definitely one I want to keep an eye on because he's definitely got the role. Just need to see this fantasy output, and if he's not just trying to be that defender first, rather I want him to try and accumulate the ball and whatnot. So just want to keep an eye on there because of the 3 midfielders, obviously Nick Dacos just absolutely soaked up all the points, and even Cripps didn't have a huge amount of influence either. So it just seemed like Nick Dacos soaked up all the points. So we'll have to wait and see next week, but still quite bullish on what he can do. You can even see the CBAs here. Perryman was the number 1 that took most of the CBAs, even ahead of Dacos and Cameron. So that was quite nice to see that he is in that role. Obviously, Cripps was a bit down there and let Allen run through there every so often, so that was nice. Kick-ins was definitely something I was interested in with Josh Dacos going back there and Houston. I think he can cross both of them off your list in terms of if you're looking to start them. Especially Houston, he looked quite horrible in this game. Honestly, he only scored 21 fantasy points, which, again, not looking at the fantasy points too much, but just giving it as an indicator of the role. His role was not as nearly as nice as it was at Port, so for those many reasons, I would not start him, especially at his elevated 94 price tag. But that will sort of do it for Collingwood. I'll move on to Brisbane, I believe. And I guess where do you start with this star-studded lineup? Back off a premiership. They just had people everywhere, but they had a lot of people that are still out. So just to name a few, they had Gardner, McCarthy still recovering from his ACL, same with Duday and Coleman. They had Eric Cookwood, who didn't come over for the travel. Darcy Fort, I guess he's probably not best 22, but he's always there or thereabouts. And then it had Starcevic out as well. So a lot of names out, and so a lot of roles have sort of shifted and changed. So it's a little bit tricky to sort of understand where everyone's sat. But Zorko, Dunkley, and Neil were just at their usual best. Again, can you start them? If you're super keen on them and if you think they're potential value, then absolutely go for it. But my general rule is they have the early buy. I just don't think I could do it, especially Zorko, even though he could be a very good defender, could be the number 1 defender for the season. I just don't know, with the likes of Coleman eventually coming back, Duday, if he ever comes back, who knows. just a few others there. So I just don't know if the points will be spread out, so I'm not super keen on him. Neil especially, I'm not super keen on. I don't think he's got that ceiling that we're sort of looking for anymore since Dunkley's come over. So Dunkley's definitely the more interesting one, but again, he's already at an elevated price, so probably not looking there until a later stage. Moving down the list, Will Ashcroft was obviously a big name that everyone sort of wanted to have a look at. He was probably slightly underwhelming in his role. You can see his score here if I can find it. Will Ashcroft only had the 20 points, very underwhelming for what you would expect in a half time. However, the role did look good, so I would definitely give it a pass mark if you're looking at purely on the role. He did look like he became that third midfielder. I can probably even show you his CBAs here. So he shows you here he is the number 3 midfielder. He's overtaken McCluggage now, so in that terms his role has improved. So his points are going to be able to increase based off that. So for those sort of reasons, it's definitely worth another look next week. But if he doesn't start to hit some form, then I'd potentially just jump off and look to jump on him if he finds his straps a little bit later in the season, especially with that round 3 bye. So yes, you can still keep him. I think he's around 30% at the moment owned. So if you're really keen on him and you're not looking at the scores too much, absolutely just lock him in. He looks like he'll go to a new level this year. Whether he can get his points up to 100 is probably very skeptical. It's probably more likely going to be around that 90 range, which is still a decent amount, even though he's priced around like that 82, I believe, somewhere around there. And the other person that we need to talk about, obviously, was Levi Ashcroft, his brother. Now, there is a lot of doubt around Levi Ashcroft after this game for me. He did not play in the first half at all, which sort of indicates that he's not in the best 22. He came on in the second half of the game, whatever you want to call it, and he played a lot of midfield and played a bit of wing. So for those sort of reasons, he's very much in doubt on my side for selection, but I do need to see a little bit more next week. He did play extremely well when he was in the midfield, so maybe he's done enough to put his hand up to be, okay, I can play in this team. So definitely one I want to keep an eye on. We know how good he is. He just needs to get in the lineup and not be a sub risk, which is obviously a huge risk when you're trying to play for the Premiership side, trying to go back to back. So one to definitely keep an eye on next week, but I am getting a bit cold feet with just looking at starting him. Just looking quickly down the list, I don't really think there's anyone else too much to notice. Bailey did his usual preseason game where he just absolutely goes ballistic and tries to suck us in. I'm probably not reading into it too much. He didn't have a huge amount, of points, like not consistent points. He had times where he just went absolutely ballistic. So not super keen on that one. Besides that, ask Cameron if you were keen on starting him. He didn't do super well either. So yeah, that's really Brisbane Lions. Nothing. There's no one else really worth considering at this point in time, in my opinion. We'll now move on to the Gold Coast Suns, the last team of the triple way game, however you want to say it. Now, the notable absentees for these guys, they didn't have Daniel Rowley, obviously recovering from his injury still. I think it was an MCL that he recovered from over the off-season. Flanders missed with his back injury. Charlie Bollard, Took Miller and Alex Davidson, Davids, didn't play. In terms of the midfield mix, in the rotations, it was Anderson, Rao, and Graham who clearly had that role. So Graham could be a potential interesting one, definitely one I want to keep an eye on if it looks like this is going to be his role. But again, there was no Took Miller, so I need to see what happens when Took Miller comes back. Does that then take over that Graham role? Same with Anderson. Same with Flanders. Does he take that role? We sort of expect Flanders to play a bit of a 50-50 role. Is that going to take over at least one of these guys' roles in terms of Graham or Humphreys? Because Humphreys was the other one that absolutely caught people's eye. He just was running through the midfield and just making it look like a child's game. He was absolutely went ballistic. He scored 65 points in the first half, kicked a nice goal from centre bounce as well. So he looks like he could have a bit of a breakout year, but probably needs to have that role for me to be worthwhile. So with the likes of Flanders and Miller to come back, I think there's probably little chance that he's going to continue that role, especially because they have Graham ahead of him as well. So, yeah, it's very unlikely and probably one I'll just pass on for now. Unless, Flanders and Miller are potentially out for a period of time, then absolutely, it's definitely one I'll consider. Rao was interesting. He obviously had his main CBA role, nothing unusual there, but he did also spend a bit of time forward, so it looks like he's trying to increase his forward craft a little bit more, which was nice to see. Again, would I pay up for it? Probably not, especially with the round 2 buy. It's just tricky, especially at that price range. I'd have to see a significant upside to really have a look at it, so probably not. But in saying that, I did consider Anderson, and given the fact that they have probably the nicest run to start the season in terms of, matchups. It's definitely someone I've considered to look at and considered starting my side just to have that bit of a bump to start the season. You get one game out of them. They might go 130, 140, then you trade them out or something like that to another mid-pricer or something like that. So definitely something I've considered, but probably unlikely with Rao. Noble, in his first showing at halfback for the Suns, was a little bit disappointing. Where was he? He only scored the 29. Didn't sort of look like he was going to be that fantasy accumulator like we sort of expected with, that being such a nice role, which we've seen, Flanders go back there, Sexton was there, and even a Jeffrey had bid back there during stages last year, so that didn't seem to be happening as much in this game. That could obviously change in the actual season. But they did also have Weller back there who did quite well. 35 off halftime isn't amazing, but definitely was probably the star of that back line for them. So probably a bit of a pass on Noble for now. We do need to see what happens when Rioli comes back. Rioli definitely could be the one that they look to use and distribute the ball off of. So definitely more interested in Rioli there than Noble. And finally, Lombard unfortunately dislocated his shoulder in a bit of a big bump and probably looks unlikely to start now. I don't think he was super fantasy relevant because he is a small forward anyway, but just thought I'd mention that there if you were still looking at him. He did only score the 7 points as well before going off. Besides that, really no one else that I can think of looking at here. A lot of these guys will probably make way when a few of the other big names come in. So that will be it for the first match. Let's move on to GWS and Sydney, if I can find that. Maybe we'll go Adelaide Crows first, because that's just the way that these stats sort of come down, and it's probably the easiest way. So we'll go with the Adelaide Crows first, and obviously they had a much stronger side to play in this match against Port Adelaide. They were only missing Rankin, Michael, Annie, and Scholl and Cumming. So probably put a line through Cumming now that he's still managing that hamstring injury. Didn't even look that good last week either, so probably just one I'd avoid and get off now. So it's very unlikely that he will score well for us. And you could tell in the game last week that he just wasn't moving freely. So I'd just put a cross through him for a starting terms. He could be potential value for us later down the season if he does get his body right and he does start to move a bit more freely and get a bit of a better role. So probably one I'll put a line through for now. In terms of the midfield mix, it was completely different to last week. It saw Saligo play as a predominant midfielder, where he last week was playing as a full-time wingman. So that was a bit interesting to see, but the one that we were really looking at was Peatling. Obviously played majority time forward in the first quarter, but was much better in the second quarter, playing mostly CBA. So definitely still pretty bullish on what he can do. Even when he wasn't playing in the CBAs, he was able to score around the ground. I don't think, doesn't quickly show too much of the first, but he scored 76 in 3 quarters, so he was definitely on track for a ton. So he's just a lock in my opinion to start in the midfield there. Yeah, I do want to still see what happens with Rankin coming back. Obviously, the whispers of him playing full-time midfield definitely could affect Peatling a little bit. So I definitely want to see it next week for sure. So keep an eye on that one. Dawson spent majority of the time in the midfield, so definitely another big tick for him if you were keen on starting him with a fairly nice run to start the season. He did spend some time forward when he was just resting, and obviously, they had Peatling, Sligo, and a couple others that ran through there. Just blank at the moment. Crouch was the other one, and Draper. So I definitely don't think he's much of a concern there. He even floated back a fair bit, a few times, and got some plus sixes. So really, it's looking to return to that main role where we saw him go 112, 113 the year prior, where he just sort of goes all around the ground, just accumulating, demanding the ball, being the captain. He's got a great mark overhead, obviously a great kick, so they look for him. So definitely one I was quite interested in starting there. I think he's even starting to think that he starts to avoid some tags with the likes of Rankin potentially moving into the midfield. Rankin's going to be a lot more damaging than the likes of a Dawson. So that could be a lot of benefit to Dawson in the fact that he'll get less attention, meaning he'll be a lot more consistent with his scoring. So definitely want to see what happens with the role next week because, again, Rankin coming into the midfield could affect any one of these midfielders that are coming into it, but more than likely it will affect the likes of Draper, who only spent 5%. Only had 5 CBAs in this game, so it's slightly a bit more concerning that he isn't going to be part of that midfield mix again with Rankin coming back. He didn't do too badly. Like 18 isn't great. It's not great at all. So he's definitely one I'm getting pretty cold feet on. That I don't know if he's going to be best 22, and he's definitely going to be a potential sub risk. So just seems like these rookies in the midfield are just falling like dominoes at the moment. Just it's such a hard spot to sort of break into. It is very, very tricky. So one to keep an eye on, but he just purely played like a 50-50 midfield half forward split, and he just couldn't really get his hands on the ball elsewhere. So definitely one I will keep an eye on next week. If the role improves, if it decreases, then he potentially is out of my side. The other rookie in Curtin as a 300k forward was a little bit quiet. He didn't do a huge amount. Where is his score if I can find him? Curtin, he scored 31 in 3 quarters, so it isn't great. He predominantly played half forward and on the wing. Didn't get a huge amount of touches on the wing, so that was quite different to how we've seen Crows play previously. So I'm still keen on him, obviously at that cheap price as a bench option for us. I don't think he's worth putting on field just with the volatile scoring. So definitely I want to keep an eye on, but again, getting cold feet, especially with a lot of other options opening up in these particular games. So keep an eye on that. Just quickly going through the list, Lego dominated. If you could justify the pick, I know a few of my Crows mates were very keen on him after watching this game. He just looked like he's taking his game to a new level, and I wish he did that last year when I owned him. But no, I don't know if he's going to be one that absolutely makes or breaks your season. He's more of an impact player, in my opinion. He did require 3 goals to get these 81. He had 2 of those in the second quarter and 1 in the third quarter. Even in the first quarter, when he looked like he was absolutely dominating, he only scored like a 14 points. So I just put a line through him. I don't think he's going to be that accumulative guy that we're sort of looking for, unfortunately. Laird did a lot better this game. Played the 3 quarters, scored 74. He was just looking like he was going to be that halfback distributor, just sort of spreading and getting a lot more of the plus sixes like we sort of expected. So it's tricky. I don't want to even consider him, especially as a midfield only, even though he might get defender status. Or we definitely will get defender status at round 6 or round 7, however that is working this year. I just don't know if I can pay up. He's priced at 99 or something like that, so I don't know how much more upside's going to be there. So one, I'll probably just pass and evaluate at a later stage, even though he could be a potential top 6 forward for us. Sorry, top 6 defender. And that sort of probably about does it, I think. Miller, if you're keen on him, I know he's a much cheaper price than someone that we have spoken about for many years. He looked like he did okay, but again, probably not a huge amount of value. He only scored a 33. so probably not super keen. Crouch was a bit less today. Neil Bullen, 51 as a half forward, not looking at that. So that's probably it for the likes of the Crows. You can see the CBA numbers here. And you can see it's predominantly Crouch, Dawson, and Saligo with Peatling running through there as well. So now we'll move on to Port Adelaide. And there were some interesting numbers here. So Bergman was actually the surprise one for me. He looked like he was being that main distributor off halfback, not the likes of Farrell or Burton or Sin or anything like that. It seemed like they wanted the ball in Bergman's hands, but he was also doing quite well as an interceptor. So he was sort of playing a little bit as an intercepting role, similar to like a James Sicily or Liam Jones, something like that. So he can be a bit of a risk to be able to lockdown defender, though, especially with their limited stocks down back. I could see a world where he has to play a lockdown defender role, playing on another tool. So I am probably unlikely to start him, but he looked really good in this game, and obviously wanted their ball in their hands quite a fair bit. So definitely one I want to keep an eye on. Farrell was pretty quiet in this game. I'll try and find his number. His number is 35 in 3/4, so again, not great. So probably puts a line through him at his elevated price of like 80, so I don't think I could start him there, but definitely worth another look because we are still looking for that main distributor to take Houston's role, but I just don't think we're going to get that, unfortunately, at the moment. Rosie was another one that is fairly popular along the fantasy community and one that we all wanted to see. He only scored the 63. He was fairly quiet to start the game, so I think he only had like 3 or so possessions in the first quarter. It was quite lackluster. He just couldn't really get his hands around the ball at all, so it took him a little while to adjust. But in the end, he came pretty good and scored the 63 in 3/4. So not bad. Again, still presents some value, but and with an early with a pretty good early run, definitely could be one that we consider. I just need to see it next week. He did enough to give you a tick, so definitely one that you could be having in your starting squad. Jason Horne-Francis, another one. He just went absolutely ballistic again this game, really thriving in that third midfielder rotation. You can see that he could probably even potentially be number 1 out of those 3 now. So that was interesting to see, and it was interesting to see that still they really rotated those guys through there. So it wasn't like it was okay. Horne-Francis, Rosie, and Butters were the main 3. They really spread it across Wines and Drew as well. So I think that's just what we're going to see this year. It's probably not going to be the likes of 80% midfield time. It's going to be 60% across all of them. So that probably makes me a little less likely that Horne-Francis will have some improvement. He was already averaging about 54 or something like that last year, so it's probably more than likely that it's only a minimal bump, and paying that 90 or 89 price tag, I just don't see how much upside there's going to be at the moment, even though he looks absolutely the fittest he ever has. I think he's dropped a bit of weight, but put on a bit of muscle at the same time. So you're really banking on natural progression, and that's not something I'm looking at doing at the moment. And especially with a lot of value in the forward line, I just don't think I'm starting with him at this point in time. And I guess that sort of does it for Port Adelaide. Joe Barry was another one that looked pretty good. He was pretty lively. He got up the ground a fair bit as well, so definitely one that we could consider on the bench, I would say. A small forward, probably not banking that he's going to have too much of a influence or a fantasy game to him that much, so not super keen there. Richards, first time we've seen him in Port colours. He did okay, but probably, again, small forward, not someone I'm looking at. Sweet is another one that a lot of people are looking at starting, with a lot of the speculation and obviously dramas with the ruck line. People looking at just starting Sweet as a potential, some value, and to see how the dust settles. I just didn't see much that I liked, really. He played the full game out. You can see he would have had non-played in the 4th, but he only scored 61, so really wasn't optimal. And he was only against Riley O'Brien, who can be quite nice for points. So he just purely relies on tap outs in these games. So Again, I probably just couldn't do it. I don't see the point or the upside. I'd rather just go set and forget and not have to worry about the rucks this year. That's just the way I'm leaning. Besides that, just looking through the names, the coach just didn't do anything amazing. Yeah, there's really no one else. Pal Pepper returning from ACL. Again, probably not no one I would look at. So let's move on to the next game. Let's see which one it's going to be. I think it'll be the North Melbourne game. North Melbourne and Demons. So we'll start with North Melbourne. Obviously, a very fantasy-friendly game. Game style. And to start off with, Powell is just continuing on his power trip this season, this preseason particularly. Same with Phillips, obviously being the number 1 and 2 there at the moment. Both are getting plenty of it with a nice CBA role. Powell probably slightly in favour in terms of that role. You can just see that based on the CBAs. They are just, I don't know why Clarko's just letting him run that midfield at the moment. But there's still the concerns for me for both of them is that Simkim's due back at some stage and probably will slot in that midfield. We've heard that he's going to have, a 50-50 split, very similar to a Parker. So that probably bumps the likes of a Phillips, but I wouldn't be surprised if Clarko's seen enough to just be like, Simkim, you're out, sorry. Phillips have the role. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when they come back. Sheasel was a bit of a concern in this game. He only had the 9 CBAs for the entire game. He did play the 4 quarters. Still scored quite fairly well, like 99, nothing amazing. He did go back in that 4th quarter though, and he racked up quite nicely. I think he was only on 67 at 3/4 time, which is still reasonable, but not meeting his break even of 112. So slightly concerning, but we know he's going to rack at some point. I just need to see the role in a proper game. Last week he played full-time midfield minutes pretty much, so they're probably just going to look to change a few things up here and there. So definitely one I want to keep an eye on, especially if I'm looking to pay for that big price tag of his. Daniels, you can't go past Daniels. He just absolutely obliterated this preseason game. He was quite early, but he racked it up so easily that he just got to a very decent score at 96. So no concerns there. Role looked awesome again in a proper game. So lock him in your forward lines. I don't need to say too much else there. Cherry did enough, 3/4 time. Didn't play 4th quarter on 68. Did enough just to get a tick in that rock battle against Campbell, who is a tougher opponent. Minimal tackles again. Obviously, it's a practice match. You don't want to go too hard. You don't want to hurt yourself, so no point doing that much. Did take a few marks around the ground, which is nice to see, adding that sort of weapon to his game to make a more consistent scoring. Sorry, what the hell am I looking at? No, I'll skip at that. I was gonna say that was a very minimal amount of CBAs, particularly in the first half. There was only 10, but in the end of it, there was 18, up to 3/4 time. So it did open up a little bit more in the second half, which would have made him able to score more points, obviously getting more hit outs. The thing that concerned me slightly was that he didn't seem to be taking it out of the contest as much. We saw all last preseason that he was renowned for just taking it out of the ruck, putting on the boot, instead of getting just the 1 point for the hit out, he would get, 3 for the kick or 2 for a handball. So that's what made him so good at being a fantasy ruckman for us. I want to see him back to doing that a bit more. He did it sometimes, but he didn't seem to be doing it as much. He seemed to be relying more on the hit out to, the smaller guys around him. So bit of a concern there for me, but I still think he's going to score quite well to be a worthwhile pick for us. And I still think he'll be a top 2 ruckman for the year. Interestingly, Darling was doing the relieving role, so that's be something interesting to note during the season. So that's obviously something that's changed over the preseason. Whether it's going to have a negative effect or even no effect at all was just something I wanted to have a look at. He seemed to be doing a bit more than what I would expect around the ground, so a bit of a one I want to watch there. McKercher purely played as a half forward pretty much, so we obviously know Sullivan and Brad Bailey Scott are probably going to be their wingmen. It looks like McKercher's going to start on the half forward flank, and then, run along that wing and run through the middle there as well. So he's even pushing into the contest from the half forward arc. So that's one I'm particularly interested in, but again, probably not enough to be interested at his 82 price range. I just don't see the upside there too much. I know a few other people are. Only scored the 61 in this game. Did play the full game out as well. So again, probably not one I'm looking at, but definitely one to keep an eye on. We know how good he can be. Just looking through more names here. Luke Davies-Uniacke looked pretty good. Looked much better than he did last week. He, again, continued to go back and take a lot of +6s, so looking to add to his game, but again, probably unlikely to get a consistent amount of that back there with a few other guys that do that. Parker was much better this week, but again, probably unlikely at his over 800k price range. Hanson Jr. could be a potential cash power. He looked pretty good on the half forward flank for them. O'Sullivan only played the 3 quarters, but he only scored the 31. So again, scoring is going to be very volatile in that wing, but I still think he will be quite a good rookie for us and probably one of the biggest locks in terms of he's going to be best 22 for us. It's just depending on what his score is going to be there. And just looking at that kick-ins for Daniel is absolutely gorgeous. Taking the 7 kick-ins. Predominantly in the first 3 quarters, and I think Sheasel took the one at the end there in the 4th quarter. So no concerns there with Daniels. Just lock him in your side, and I think there's a few others there that we need to consider a bit more. Moving on to the Demons, there are a few different options here that we need to look at. Rivers, obviously someone that we've mentioned previously on this channel that is a huge watch. I owned him last year, and I hoped he went on that massive tear, but these practice matches just absolutely open up for these sort of guys that have that two-way running, that defensive mindset to him. They've come off the halfback flank previously, so they have that demand of the ball in the halfback. So he looked absolutely amazing through the midfield without Petrarca and Viney, and that's probably a huge flag is when they come back. What's his role going to be? It's more than likely he's going to be the 4th midfielder, so his numbers will be slightly down, but that still potentially means he can be a bit of upside. Could be definitely some value there. So he got plenty of +6s off across the halfback and around the ground. As we know, he can be a bit of accumulator. Definitely an option as a starting defender. So one I want to see again next week with hopefully the likes of Viney in the side. I don't think Petrarca will be there just yet with his rib injury. I don't know the latest on what's happening with that, but yeah, definitely still not looking like he's near to the ground just yet. But besides that, Melbourne had a plethora of players out. Like, they probably only fielded half of their best 22. So Gorm was out, Petrarca, May, Salem, Langdon, Windsor, McVie, Viney, Melksham, and French was all out. So that's 10 players probably from their best 22 that was already out. So this made it pretty tricky to sort of understand exactly where everyone's going to be. Moving down the list here, you got Sparrow, who did really well. He looks to be replacing the likes of Neil Bullen, who obviously has been traded to Adelaide. So that could potentially mean he gets a bit of upside. I haven't particularly looked at what his price is at just yet, but definitely one that you could have a look at if he's going to have a bit of an uptake. I'll try and get his price up real quick here. Pickett ran through the midfield a fair bit as well. We can see his numbers here, 14% or 14 CBAs. So Sparrow is priced at 665k, 24 age midfielder, 65 price tag. So obviously no buy. If he's going to be much better, I think Neil Bullen averaged 80 or 85 in that role, so definitely could be a bit of upside there. He is a midfielder only though, which is a bit of a bummer. I think we have plenty of other value in there, so probably one I won't look at too much, but yeah. Oliver, the other big name in there, looked back to his usual program realistically. He was just being an absolute accumulator in there. Didn't score the most fantasy-wise. He got plenty of touches, but he didn't really get much around the ground in terms of marks or tackles. A lot of his tackles still slipped, which was a bit frustrating, but I think that could definitely be improved when it comes to a bit more intensity in the actual season. So definitely one I'm still keen on. Like I said, he was very handball happy, rarely put it on the boot, so probably just doesn't quite have that confidence yet by foot. So definitely want to see that improve before the season. And the thing that I noticed just by the vibe from Melbourne is that he's still really trying to buy in his teammates. He gave off an easy set shot in front of goal. I think he was only 30 meters out, and he gave it to someone that was only, maybe 2-3 meters closer than him, directly in front. So he's still really trying to buy and get on the good side of his teammates to allow him to get more ball. So it's still something I want to improve just by the vibe of Melbourne. He does rely and need his teammates to back him in to get a lot of those points, to give him those 1-2s, and just to be able to trust him with the ball in hand around the ground. There was just a few times where his teammates just burnt him off. He was looking for the 1-2, and their teammates just didn't give it back to him. So that's a little frustrating, and probably puts a little bit of a limit or a ceiling on what his potential is going to be this season. I think, he's not going to go back to his 110 ways. I think we can rule that out in terms of what he's going to do. I think he can be much closer to a 90 for us this year, and that's probably about it. I would be great if I'm wrong, but just the vibe I'm sort of getting from him and his teammates, I don't think he's going to be that absolute bull in there. Definitely could change with the likes of Petrarca and Viney in there, though. They definitely could look for him a lot more. So locking him on my side for now until things change. The thing that I also found interesting that is he was even doing some sprints along the boundary after the game. So he's just looking fit and still really trying to get into the preseason and prove that he's worthwhile to be there. Moving on to a few rookies that we need to discuss. Laurie also had a fair chunk of these CBAs. He was a bit of a surprise one I saw in there, but again, with Petrarca and Viney out in the side, probably unlikely to get that role, but maybe he could pick up a role elsewhere. Langford was the one that really looked confident for me. Where is his score? Where can I see him? Yep, Langford there. He played as a predominant midfielder into that game. 15 CBAs. That looks like what his role is going to be. So he looks like he's going to be a lock for the best 22, probably as the fourth or even fifth midfielder for them. So I really like what he's going to be doing this year. So hopefully he's already my side. So I'm liking what he's going to do and what he's going to produce. We know he's a big fantasy scorer as well, so he can definitely provide some big scores for us. Lindsay was the other one who purely played on the wing, so I think that's pretty much his role, especially with the likes of Windsor going back. So yeah, one I want to see next week, but definitely getting a lot closer to picking both of the mid Melbourne boys. So definitely keep an eye on those two there. The other wing that I should mention in there is Langdon, who didn't play in this game, but he will definitely be on the opposite side to that one. It's just whether the likes of Windsor is still on the wing, or is he going to play that halfback role, which we sort of have been flagged throughout the preseason. Woden was another one that did play on the wing in this game with Langford out, so he did score quite well in that role. But again, where does he play with Langdon back in? Maybe half forward where we sort of expect him, or maybe in halfback. I'm not too sure. So definitely one I want to keep an eye on. I don't think that role stays consistent, so I can't pick that one. Sharp was absolutely sharp in front of goal. I think he kicked 4 goals. Probably not fantasy relevant for us though, so just blowing that one off that straight away. And that probably does it for Melbourne. We'll move on to the next game, which will be the Carlton and St Kilda game, which was very fantasy relevant for us. A lot of names that we need to discuss in this one. And I guess firstly off the top, we need to address the elephant in the room, and that is that Jagger Smith is done for the season. He has ruptured his ACL in a very unusual way. He got tackled by McRae late in the third quarter, and unfortunately he hobbled off, which I thought he'd be all right. He looked like he'd be, just strap it up and he'd be good to go again, but Unfortunately, the news has come out today that he has done his ACL. So cross him off your fantasy list, get him out of your teams. That is probably the biggest fantasy injury we've had all season, which is huge. We know he was going to be a huge scorer for us. He's got massive junior numbers, so that's a huge loss for us, and obviously a huge loss for him in his first season. So hopefully he gets back better than ever, and we'll be keen to pick him next season when he is undoubtedly going to be very cheap for us. So definitely want to keep an eye on that one. Very sad news indeed. But back into the game, talking about Carlton first, we will talk about where do we want to start? So I guess the big news is that Pt.2 was the main ruck, which is obviously hugely disappointing, and I think that's mainly due to the fact that Curnow was out and is looking like he'll be out for the first month or two of the season due to his surgery. So Tom de Koning is going to play a lot forward. So that means you gotta rule him out now. I think he's definitely going to play a lot of split duties, and predominantly going to play forward when they need him there. So that is very, very disappointing indeed. So now we've got to look and shuffle what we need to do in the ruck line. He's going to play as a tall forward. He did score a 77, but he did score a 40 in the third quarter when they looked to change it up, and they did throw Pt.2 as that tall forward and let de Koning be that main ruckman in there. So that is a very inflated number into what I would normally expect, and obviously it's still less than what he is priced at that 900k price tag. So I think you got to rule it out now. I don't see that changing unless things magically change in the next week or two before round one. I don't think it's going to change. So ruling him out at this point in stage, which is super disappointing. Doherty, in his first outing, we saw he was still quite decent. Like, he's obviously scored the 83, which is over what he's priced at just. I think he's priced at 77. He still looked like he could be that main distributor of halfback. He just still has that game into him and that ability to demand the ball when in transition from D50. He was also running through the midfield quite heavily. So he had the third most CBAs in there, so fourth behind the likes of Hewitt, Chera, and Cripps. Keeping in mind that Walsh is still due to come back at some stage. I think he's right to come round one, but he just didn't play in this game with a bit of a hamstring injury, I believe. So that is still a bit of a concern, but I would like to see what happens when Walsh comes back. Does he move to more of a halfback role? That would be very interesting. So we know what Doc can do. He just needs the right role to be and get the fantasy scores. So definitely want to keep an eye on. But he didn't do it particularly in this game, but still scored quite well as a midfielder. Chera looked good if you were looking to start him. Scored the 71. He looked like he was moving quite freely. Obviously, he went over to Doha to try and tackle all his hamstring injuries. So he looks like he's moving freely and looks like he's probably in the best shape of his life. So that could definitely mean a bit of upside for him. He is definitely worth a look next week. He wasn't overly busy in that midfield role. He did sort of rely a lot to when he floated back to get a lot of cheap +6s, particularly in the second quarter, and even kicked a nice goal in that 71 as well. So upside is definitely limited in my opinion. So probably not one I'm super keen on, especially with the injury risk. But definitely one if you're keen on. He did enough to give you a tick mark, and if he does well next week, then he'd be worthwhile start. Hollands, we're definitely obviously keen with this one. He scored the 66 in the game there. Played purely as a halfback in that typical distributor location on the centre halfback. Built into the game quite well. I think he scored a 33 in the first quarter. So he did quite well to start off with, and it obviously looked great. But then slowly dwindled off as the game sort of changed and rotated. So wasn't, in the end of the day, it wasn't overly impressive that it was like, okay, we've got to pick this guy, but definitely one I want to see a bit more on in a proper game. He took 1 or 2 kick-ins, so will receive some kick-ins there, which will be nice and bump up his average slightly, but maybe not receiving enough that it will be a huge up bump for him. So enough to give it a tick because the role was great, but the output just didn't seem quite on top of its game at that point in time. So definitely one I want to keep an eye on next week in the community series. Obviously, that'll be the last time we'll be able to see him before picking him at round 1. So my eyes will be glued to that screen because I'm really bullish on starting him. I just need to see it a bit more. Haynes was another one that we wanted to look at. He scored the 52. He was playing that intercepting role off halfback. He did quite well being an interceptor, but didn't look like it was going to be fantasy relevant in my eyes. Just didn't really seem like he was going to get the ball as often as what we wanted. Definitely not the same as what his days were at GWS. So probably putting a line through him at his elevated price there. Just going through a few others, I guess. Here, Hewitt as that main midfielder did quite well. I don't know how I feel about starting him. I think he is already quite highly priced. I just don't know if he's going to be one that is worthwhile as a pure midfielder. I'll quickly check his price tag here. He is 852k. Obviously, doesn't have the buy, which is quite nice. It would just be interesting to see what happens with his role because he already sort of had the main midfield role next to Cripps and Walsh. So I just don't see where the upside's coming from. I just think this game sort of suited him a little bit more as a bit more of a tackling pressure guy in there. So I think most of that points would have come from tackles. Binns did quite well, but again, probably not one that is going to get into the side very often with a few bigger names coming back. And that probably about it does it, to be honest, which is a bit disappointing. I thought there'd be a few more that I was keen on. We'll move over to Saints, who obviously are very, very fantasy relevant, and a lot of people put their hands up in this game. This game just went absolutely off. So, still, starting at the top, he had a massive game. Probably one of the best games we've seen in probably the best form of his life since, falling off at the halfway point of last season. So he looks like he could be a bit of a pod for you if you wanted to look at him to start the season. Obviously, no early buy, so definitely a viable option there. For sure, he looked like he was just back to his tackling best and got plenty of it around the ground, plus sixes and whatnot. I think McRae definitely helped him around that sort of ground a fair bit, not having to do the in and under work as much. He was able to get the ball out to him a fair chunk of the time, so that really, they worked quite well together. And he obviously led the way with the fantasy points. So no issue with his role, and definitely the fantasy output was there. So I definitely don't mind him there. If you're keen on starting him, he's definitely come into my calculations now that I've seen what I wanted to with the likes of McRae going in there. I did have concerns that with McRae going to the midfield that the points would be less going to Steele, and that's what I think all of the fantasy community thought. But I think looking at this game and evaluating it actually probably helped him a fair bit more because he was able to do a lot of the other stuff around the ground a lot more often rather than just being the in and under player that we sort of become used to. So yeah, definitely pretty bullish on what he could do to start the season. Wangani Malira did well, got plenty of touches, but the thing that I found was it wasn't just the cheap possessions that I was sort of expecting, being the main guy back there, I thought there'd be a fair bit of ball going through him and getting a lot of plus sixes. He was sort of playing that Sinclair role where he just came up to the back of stoppages, and that's the way he sort of got a lot of his points. Just the ball sort of came out to him and he got a quick kick away. So definitely pretty good. Much better showing this week than what he did in the the All-Stars game. So definitely one I want to consider starting again in this game this year. I think he's got a bit of upside, particularly with the likes of Sinclair potentially missing round 1, but he should be okay. We'll wait and see. McRae, what more can I say? He is locked in for that full-time midfield role. He was just behind Jack Steele there. He looked great. Back to the McRae of just absolutely just grabbing the ball whenever he can and getting it out. So he's just a lock, even though he's elevated price of 71. He's just a lock in our forward lines. No need to question that at all. He'll go up and potentially be F1, if not F2, in my opinion. Harry Boyd as our R3 or even R2, if you're considering that. He did really well, scored the 90. We know he's going to be a a very good cash cow for us if he can break into the side for round one. We just got to see it with what happens with Marshall back. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see that for round one. It's really just going to come down to that Thursday night, if Boyd is going to be named in the best 22 or not. Because very highly likely he's going to be named as the emergency and not play, and Marshall's just going to play a solo ruck. So one I definitely want to keep an eye on. He's obviously locked in as my R3 at this point in time, but very unlikely to probably start, I would have thought, just with the way I'm reading things. But pretty much that does it for the main guys back there. Now, a plethora of rookies put their hand up in this game. Like, just an unusual amount. And while there were a few notable players out, I'll rattle them off here quickly. Marshall, Sinclair, Philippou, Wood, Henry, Clark, Howard, Jones, Shawmaker, and King were all out, so there probably was 8 or 9 players that were there. There were just a plethora of rookies that are putting their hand up for round one. So Garcia was probably the main one that caught a lot of people's eye. He was purely playing as an inside mid, and that looks like he's going to be his role. Like, looking at the guys that are out, like Sinclair potentially would be the only one that would replace that role. Obviously, Philippou would definitely replace that role, but he's out for the first half of the season. Potentially Jones as well, but I doubt he's probably more fringe than anything. So Garcia looks like he's a lock for that midfield role and replacing that Philippou role for now. He just is massively cheap for what he's going to be able to do in that role. He's obviously cheap for a reason, though. He got a lot of vests last year. I think he had 5 or 6 vests in the back half of last year. So he is priced way down at like 421k as a forward eligible option, so he just slotted into my midfield quite quickly after that match, being a bit reactionary there, but he just looks like he's going to be the goods, and he scored a nice 80, just absolutely tackling his way there, and even getting a fair bit of his hands on the ball, so I liked him there. Box Shoal, I actually never said his name before, but I think that's right. Box Shoal played as the 4th midfielder. I'll show you CBAs here, so had 11 CBAs in that side as a 4th midfielder. Now, he will be interesting when the likes of Sinclair comes back, because I do think Sinclair takes that role quite quickly in round one if fit. So probably unlikely, but would be interesting to see if his role gets squeezed to go elsewhere, and definitely could be a worthwhile pick as a 230k. Is he a midfielder? I think he's a midfielder. Yeah, he's a midfielder. 230k midfielder. So definitely want to keep an eye on for that one. He looked great. Scored the... Where'd he go? Scored the 79. So he did some quite nice things. Even kicked a nice goal as well. So does have some forward craft about him. So he could play a bit of half forward. So not ruling him out for being round one. Hasty was another one that caught a lot of people's eye in that halfback role. He's another 230k midfielder. Obviously, we're well aware of a lot of the injury issues at St Kilda at the moment, with no Howard and no Shawmaker particularly in this game. Then obviously you had Sinclair back there and a few others that are injured. So he sort of fitted in that role quite well. Sorry guys, I need a bit of a drink. My throat's getting a bit sore. So Hasty did really well in that halfback role. He was just throwing his body around a fair bit. Even took a very nice mark. Scored the 73. They were happy to put it in his hands, but I do have a bit of a sneaking suspicion that that role may not be his when it comes to actual the season. For some reason, Shawmaker didn't play in this side, but I would highly expect that's sort of his role. So definitely one I want to keep an eye on. But obviously, be hugely keen to start him if he is that in the side and he's in that best 22 at that price tag. So he can definitely be a decent option. And the last one was O'Connell as a 230k defender. Scored 63. He looked like he was pretty decent, so definitely another one to keep an eye on, but unlikely due to a lot of the other guys to return in that defensive line. So again, a lot of guys to keep an eye on, but again, there's a lot of names that are missing, so best to just give them a tick. They all did well, all did enough to have another look next week, but we need to see what happens when they are in full strength, and obviously we need the job security from them. Besides that, just quickly scanning through the list of any other names that I wanted to discuss. Windhager was a bit of a surprise for me. I'm still quite surprised why he isn't playing as that third or fourth midfielder. That was predominantly his role last year. I don't know what's changed over the preseason, but he's just not being used as that at all now. He only didn't have any CBS. He was purely played as a half forward. So that is really interesting and one thing to note. Whether that stays consistent, I would hope so, but I'm not 100% sure. Travaglia was another one that obviously a lot of people had in their sides. I think he was still 50% owned before that game happened, but he only played the fourth quarter, which screams the fact that he probably won't be in the best 22 and won't play round one. So I've already played around with removing him from my side, and it is starting to become a bit of a rookie crisis in terms of that backline, particularly. You know, we don't have a huge amount of rookie options down there, so I'm starting to look at a bit of a restructure to really remove that rookie from that defensive line. So I do probably encourage a lot of other people to do that as well, because it's looking like we're going to have very little options back there that are going to be fantasy scorers as well. So definitely one to keep an eye on. I think we've only got one more game to go, and that is the GWS and Sydney game. And we'll start off with Sydney Swans now. And it wouldn't be a practice match if you didn't have Errol Goulden just absolutely going massive. You know, he's just such a hard worker in these games. He doesn't care it's a practice match. He just works hard every day. So no concerns there with him. His full fitness. The only concern, maybe slightly, is that he didn't have as many CBAs that we're probably used to him having. He only had the 6 of the 24 that was available, or that was there for others. So that probably means he has a slight decline in terms of that role, but doesn't mean he's going to have a slight decline in his fantasy output. We know how good he is on the outside, so no concern there for me. If you're seeing start on him, he gives an absolute tick, but he does have that round 3 bye. And he is obviously at an elevated price tag. Grundy did quite well. He did play against the likes of Briggs, who on his day can be a tougher opponent, but can also be a really easy opponent. I wouldn't say Briggs necessarily tried super hard, so I wouldn't be reading into that too much. But definitely one Grundy could be the saviour to our options in the ruck line, so I'm not ruling out anyone at this stage. I just need a heartbeat at this point, so definitely one I want having a look at next week, but not super keen on him just yet. Another a proper fantasy relevant player is Roberts that we needed to look at. First time we've seen him this year, and he only scored the 66. Probably didn't quite live up to the hype that we sort of expected. He was fairly quiet across halfback, but the role looked fine. You know, he was having a few kick-ins here and there, or had the one for the entire game, but he still got plenty of the ball off halfback, probably just not as many +6s as we expected. What I would expect when the actual fantasy season, when the proper AFL season starts, is that obviously with a lot more congestion and intensity, then that means they'll have to flick the ball around a bit more, which will obviously play into his hands a fair bit. So if you're keen on him, absolutely give him a tick for the role. There's no concern there. Just the game probably didn't suit him as well as it probably could have. Mills obviously didn't play in this game, which is unfortunate. He is managing a bit of an injury in his foot, I believe. So, yeah, one to keep an eye on. Hopefully he plays next week, because I need to see at least one game from him to give him a tick to be on my side. We know he's going to be an inside mid, so I just want to see that he's fit and healthy and that he's going to play and not be a potential risk of missing a game early in the season, because that would very, very suck. He does have the round 3 bye though, which does play into his hands a little bit. Maybe he gets through the first 3 weeks and then he can have that round 3 as a bit of a resting period on that foot. So I'm still pretty bullish on Mills. I'm not writing him off just because he has this injury and he missed the game. He's got a very good role going into, and he definitely has a lot of upside. So if he can get his body right and he's good for round 1 and even round 0, then he's definitely one I'll keep an eye on and keep a lock in my side. Besides that, they had Lloyd, Papley, Cunningham, and McDonald who missed. So a pretty healthy side when you look at it. So we can probably read into a lot of this uh, in terms of the roles that a lot of people played, and that sort of plays into the likes of Sheldrick. His hands at the moment. He played as that that fourth or fifth midfielder. So he was behind the likes of Rowbottom, Chad Warner, and Heaney, and he had the 11 CBA. So with the likes of Parker being removed from that side, obviously being traded to North Melbourne, that obviously opens up a spot to play some midfield time and across half forward. I did flag this previously. He's obviously priced at a very cheap price, like 400 and something K, 448K as a midfield only, 44 price tag. So definitely one I've been interested in. Obviously, we know how good he can be. He's averaged 80 in the past for us. Only a couple of seasons ago, he didn't play any games last year, so there's definitely a spot there for him. It's just potentially what his upside is going to be, and the only thing I want to see is with Mills in the side. Mills obviously is going to be a main contributor into that midfield. How far does that bump him back? Does it then remove him entirely, or does that bump him back to that fifth midfielder potentially, and he plays mostly half forward? Definitely would be a bit of an interesting one. So I want to see it next week. Definitely not blocking him my side at this point in time. He was also pretty shaky. He gave away a lot of free kicks. To start off, I think probably had 4 or 5 free kicks that from I saw. So he was getting frustrated. So definitely one I'm interested in, but definitely can't lock into my side just yet with the output and the role, with a few other names missing. Just to rattle off a few other names that were pretty good. Florence did pretty well at the halfback. I don't think he's super fantasy relevant, though. But definitely looked like he took a bit more of a step up. He's priced at 785K. Very similar to that Mills and Roberts sort of areas. But probably very unlikely. I don't know if it was just one-off hit, but he looked like he was pretty good. Marty kicked 6 bloody goals, but we're not picking tall forwards, unfortunately. Shout out to Jordan, who did well. Obviously, was a big starter last year for everyone. Just moving down the line here. Probably that's about it. Wicks moved into a halfback role, which was interesting, but probably not going to be worthwhile pick, unfortunately. He is a forward. What is he priced at? He's priced at 393K. So again, another very value forward option for us, but I think we probably have a few others that will be a bit more consistent. So yeah, that probably does it for Sydney. We'll move on to the final team, and that is GWS, who had a lot of people out. There is obviously a plethora of players that are out, so we'll rattle them off real quick. Green, Stringer, Taylor, Sam Taylor, obviously, Brown, Cornelia, and Wagner were all out of the side. So a lot of positions were thrown around, with obviously a few of the mid boys out at the moment. So Kelly, Bedford, and Callahan. I don't know why I mix those names up so often. Were the main midfielders in there for them in this game, with the Mellon and Daniels rotating through there a fair bit as well. So I can show you their CBA. So Kelly, Bedford, Briggs, Callahan were all the main guys, and obviously Mick Mullen was the main other guy. So yeah, it's just really hard to get a read on what's going to happen with this midfield mix, with the likes of Tom Green coming back, who drops out. Most likely, it's going to be the likes of Tim Kelly. We've known that he sort of moved away from that midfield role in previous years and played as a predominant wingman. So, sort of means some good things for Callahan if he's going to be this main midfielder. He did quite well, scoring an 87. It wasn't overly great in terms of fantasy, though. I did want to see a bit more from him, but with Green in there, definitely could be a bit of a different mix. So definitely want to see it again next week. But obviously Green isn't going to be playing, and I'd need Callahan to score quite well in the opening round to be a worthwhile pick. So definitely want to keep an eye on him, but not feeling super bullish at his price tag at the moment. I think it's at 77, so a bit of upside, but I don't know how much just yet. he has had some pretty good junior numbers in the past. Stone was also a really one I wanted to look at in this game. Obviously, we've had the news that he was going into halfback line, replacing the likes of Perryman, and that's exactly what he did in this game. So, I think he's a lock in that position as a forward for us, and I think that could be a very good fantasy role for him. Obviously, Perryman scored average like 75 in that role, so that potentially means he could get up to there, but probably will be closer to a 60. He is a basement 230k forward, so I'm locking him in my side, and he's been there for quite a while, to be honest. A couple other rookies that we want to keep an eye on are Mangrove. I think Angrove. He scored 70. He did kick 2 goals in that, and that all came in the first quarter. He predominantly played on the wing, so that is something that we need to review in the next couple of weeks with obviously Kelly and Callaghan have typically been their wingmen. So obviously with Kelly potentially going back on the wing, does that then bump Angrove out of the side, or does it move him into another position? Is something I want to review. But he did well around the ground. He was involved in the contest a fair bit, even pushing into the contest when the ball was on his side of the field. So he did quite well there, and obviously got on the scoreboard. So I think he's really pushing his case to be a potential rookie for us to start the season. I do think there's an option for him there, a particular position, particularly with Callaghan moving into a full-time midfield role. So opening up a wing spot for him. So I'm pretty bullish on what he can do. The other one was Phoenix played, and he played predominantly as a half forward. Where was he? Phoenix. What was his last name? Might be Gothard. Phoenix Gothard, I think his last name is, and he only scored the 20. He played half forward, and I just think he's unlikely. Stringer's due to come back, and they have a plethora of small forward guys up there, so I think he will be struggle to break into the side. Just looking through another few names. Ash, I know a few people are looking at, just with the likes of Perryman moving out of there. Thought he would get a bit more responsibility, but it didn't look that way. Daniels wasn't running through the midfield as much as you'd expect. He only had the 3 CBAs. Briggs, another ruckman that we wanted to keep an eye on, only scored the 62, but again, I don't think he was overly trying in this game. Whitfield was pretty disappointing in what was probably a game that would suit him a lot more. Obviously, he normally goes pretty big in these practice matches, so a 67 is a bit concerning, but the role was definitely fine. And I think that probably about does it, I think, for this game. I don't think there was anything else to note there. Leak didn't play at all. He only played in the fourth quarter, so that screams that he's not going to be best 22, unfortunately. So he has since left my side, and unfortunately that is a dream dead unfortunately, I don't know why he didn't play in the best 22. I thought he was definitely going to be there, but unfortunately he was not. So putting a line through him as a starting position at this point in time. So it's been a long episode. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this one. That is all the games reviewed. Now we are going to get into the community series. Again, I didn't shout them out at the start of the video, but please check out AFL Fantasy Ignum. Hopefully I'll say that right. They provided all the fantasy stats in the CBAs and the kick-ins and whatnot throughout this preseason, and they've been absolutely amazing. And everyone's jumped on board, so they have been great. So please give them a follow. They have done absolute God's work there. Besides that, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Till then,